Okay. Hello, everyone. My name is Caroline Murphy. I'm the Government Relations Manager at the Wildlife Society, and I am excited to welcome you all here today for a briefing entitled Refuge System 101, and it is hosted today by the Cooperative Alliance for Refuge Enhancement. We want to give a special thank you today to Representative Mike Thompson's office, as well as staffer Catherine Altome, and the federal partners that will be joining us here today. I also want to extend a big thank you to the diverse constituency of the Cooperative Alliance for Refuge Enhancement, some of whom are here with us today. You'll be learning more about the Alliance shortly. You're going to be hearing from a lot of great speakers today about the refuge system and its unique set of lands and waters and the contribution it provides to the American public. These speakers are going to be, again, from the NGO community. They're going to be federal partners as well as our congressional partners with us here today. And you may have some questions for all of them. So just a bit of housekeeping. At the conclusion of the panel presentations today, we will be doing a round of Q&A. So if you do have any questions at any point, please feel free to put those questions in the Q&A feature, and we will go ahead and try to answer them at the end of today's session. With that, I am going to go ahead and get us rolling and transition us to our first speaker today. So Catherine Altome. Catherine is the Congressional Fellow for Congressman Mike Thompson, covering climate, energy, and environmental issues. Congressman Mike Thompson currently serves as the co-chair of the Congressional Wildlife Refuge Caucus, which Catherine will be discussing with us today. Catherine joined Representative Thompson in January 2023 on a one-year fellowship through the Brookings Institution, and we are excited to have her with us today. So Catherine, go ahead and take it away.
Congressional. The caucus fortifies, preserves, and protects the National Wildlife Refuge System by supporting adequate funding, the strategic growth of the refuge system through land acquisition, and legislation to improve the refuge system as a whole. Caucus also educates members of Congress and their staff about refuge system challenges through briefings and sessions such as this one. At the moment, the co-chairs of the Wildlife Refuge Caucus are my boss, Mike Thompson, Rob Whitman, and Gabe Vasquez. You can go to the next slide. Okay, so some of the ways where we provide funding through the Wildlife Refuge System is through appropriations programmatic requests. A couple of the big ones that we do are through the Land and Water Conservation Fund programmatic request and the North American Wetlands Conservation Act programmatic request. Land and Water Conservation Fund, which was established in 1964, is America's most successful conservation program. It has outdoor recreation opportunities in every state and 98% of the counties across the country. Protects wildlife refuges in addition to national parks, national forests, and other federal areas. The 116th Congress voted to permanently authorize funding for the Land and Water Conservation Fund. However, Congress, as you know, will need to appropriate funds for it every year. So we submit a letter, which we share with all of you, to try to encourage your office to participate in this programmatic request. This past year, we secured the support of 176 Democratic and Republican offices to help appropriate this funding. The North American Wetlands Conservation Act was established in 1989 and is a unique public-private partnership-based program that matches federal and non-federal funds to protect wetlands and associated habitats for migratory birds and other wildlife. This year, we secured the support of 165 House Democratic and Republican offices to appropriate this funding for NAWCA. And if you're interested in supporting wildlife refuges, I just sort of put in your mind now, next time around, next spring, we anticipate obviously sending these again, and think about ways that you could support through these programmatic requests next year, as well as other ways. Next. Another way that the Refuge Caucus members support refuge strategic growth is through land acquisition. One of the ways that we do that, two of the co-chairs of the Refuge Caucus, my boss, Mike Thompson, and Rob Whitman, serve on the Migratory Bird Conservation Commission. That considers and approves areas of land or water recommended by the Secretary of Interior for purchase or rental by U.S. Fish and Wildlife. Recently, we approved expansions of 5 national wildlife refuges in Kentucky, New Hampshire, Washington, and Louisiana. Those are the Clarks River National Wildlife Refuge, the Green River National Wildlife Refuge, Silvio Conte, Willapa, and Cat Island National Wildlife Refuges. Next. We also provide legislative support for wildlife refuges. So every year, we support a resolution to declare a National Wildlife Refuge Week. That is usually the first week in October. And often you will find another Wildlife Caucus event associated with that. So I look forward to that in the future. We also passed in the House the Keep America's Wildlife Refuges Operational Act of 2022, which reauthorized the volunteer services, community partnership, and refuge education programs, the National Wildlife Refuge System through 2027. A bill that we are working on for this year is the Refuge System Protection Act. I have there, it was HR 4780 in the last Congress, and we hope to reintroduce it soon. This bill would give Fish and Wildlife Services the ability to collect civil damages to fund the repair of damaged refuge system resources. A lot of other federal agencies have the ability to do that. Fish and Wildlife does not. So any sort of criminal funds for people who break things or damage refuge resources goes directly into the Treasury, and then Fish and Wildlife has to use their own other funds to repair those things. This would be a way to fix that and provide for them an opportunity to collect damages that they could then use directly to repair the things that were broken. So we look for support for you when we reintroduce this in the coming months. Next. And finally, I would like to suggest that anybody who is interested would like to join us in the Wildlife Refuge Caucus. We have some exciting things coming up in the future, and this is how you can contact me. Catherine Altum at mail.house.gov. I'm in Congressman Mike Thompson's office. You can also call our main number. And over to you, Caroline.
All right. Thank you, Catherine. So next up, let's see if we can there we go. So next up, we were supposed to have Libby Marking with the National Wildlife Refuge Association join us. Libby is the Director of Government Affairs for the National Wildlife Refuge System and also chairs the coalition that is putting on this briefing today, the Cooperative Alliance for Refuge Enhancement. Unfortunately, Libby is stuck in the travel chaos that is occurring at airports right now, so she is unable to join us, but I will be providing a very brief overview of the Cooperative Alliance for Refuge Enhancement, just for your all's reference as we go ahead and dive into the uniqueness of the refuge system today with our other speakers. So the CARE Coalition, or the Cooperative Alliance for Refuge Enhancement, it is comprised of 24 wildlife, sporting, scientific, and conservation organizations. I'll show a list of all those names in a later slide. These folks, they really span the political spectrum. So in total, we represent about 16 million Americans with the power of all of our organizations combined. And we are really united by a desire to see the National Wildlife Refuge System and its conservation mission thrive for generations to come. So we are really united around ensuring that congressional offices have an understanding of what the resource-related needs are of the refuge system. Here is that list of organizations. So we have the Wildlife Society, my organization, a professional association that represents wildlife biologists and managers. We have a smattering of other organizations, again, from across the conservation arena. So National Wildlife Federation, Ducks Unlimited is here with us today. Trout Unlimited, TRCP. So we have a strong cohort of groups that really are united by this mission of adequate funding, ensuring adequate funding and resources for the refuge system. So as far as our activities as a coalition, so obviously we are putting on this briefing today. We also have some really great informational materials for you all as congressional staffers, just to get better acquainted with, the ins and outs of resource-related needs of the refuge system. So fundwildliferefuges.com, that is our coalition website. We have our public witness testimony. We submit appropriations testimony every year. We will include that for you all in a follow-up email to you all, along with the recording of this briefing. So hang tight on that. But specific to this coming fiscal year, so fiscal year 2024, we are at about $542 million for the refuge system right now, specific to fiscal year 2023. Now, as you will hear today, that does not come close to meeting the funding related needs of the refuge system. So both internal as well as external estimates have the annual funding needs of the refuge system at about $1.5 billion. And obviously, given the appropriations status right now, or the status of appropriations at present, we understand that that is a significant and huge ask. We're really just trying to relay the need, ensure that folks such as yourself have an understanding of what the challenges the refuge system and their dedicated staff are facing right now. So we do, in the testimony we will provide to you all, we do note the president's request of $625 million. That would be, significant progress to making inroads to some of the challenges we will be discussing today. But to get us started today with an overview of the refuge system, really that refuge system 101 component, is the chief of the National Wildlife Refuge System. So Chief Cynthia Martinez will be joining us. Chief Martinez has served as chief of the National Wildlife Refuge System since 2015. She is a fifth generation New Mexican and the first woman and first Hispanic to lead the National Wildlife Refuge System. She began her career with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service in 1993 and began her work with Refuge System headquarters in 2010 as the chief of the Division of Visitor Services and Communications. So again, Chief Martinez is going to go ahead and get us started today on an introduction of this unique system of lands and waters. So I will go ahead and stop sharing my screen. If Cynthia and Karina, if you want to go ahead and get rolling.
Well, thank you, Caroline. While we get that up there, I really appreciate the introduction and for you all putting this together with our Refuge Caucus as well. Appreciate, Catherine, your introduction to the Refuge Caucus. And thanks, everybody, for joining us today. I don't know, Friday before the 4th of July. Seems like a good time to talk about the National Wildlife Refuge System. So appreciate everybody's time here. So let me just start. I don't know how much people know about the refuge system, so we're just going to dive into the 101. The mission of the refuge system is to administer a national network of lands and waters for the conservation, management, and where appropriate, restoration of fish, wildlife, and plants, resources, and their habitats within the United States for the benefit of future and present generations. Basically, our mission is relevant to all Americans. We emphasize that National Wildlife Refuge System lands and waters are places where wildlife and people thrive. The overview for this presentation is really about who we are, what we do, and then how we fit into America the Beautiful. I'm going to talk about these things, and then we've got somebody that's going to dive into the infrastructure part of what we do a little bit later, in the interest of time here. So at nearly 120 years old, wildlife refuges have been a key component of public lands. Refuges provide recreational opportunities, but we also ensure wildlife conservation across the country. So really it started in 1903 when President Theodore Roosevelt founded what would become the National Wildlife Refuge System. when he established the Pelican Island National Wildlife Refuge down in Florida for the protection of birds. That background photo right there, if you've never been down there, you should. This is the Centennial Boardwalk. Starts at the bottom, and it's got a plank for every unit of the National Wildlife Refuge System that was established in the year that it was established. You go up to the top and you end up in this great overview, and out in front of you is Pelican Island. So if you've never been there, I would encourage you to go. So in addition to managing the National Wildlife Refuge System, the National Wildlife Refuge System is responsible for many activities that we oversee for the entire Fish and Wildlife Service. And so, for example, in our infrastructure management division, we help provide engineering services, not just for the National Wildlife Refuge System, but also our fish hatchery system as well. We provide wildlife health professionals, so our veterinarians to all aspects of the Fish and Wildlife Service, and we also have a social science component as well. Emergency management is another lead that the National Wildlife Refuge System has for the Fish and Wildlife Service. So many duties that we have, we extend to the rest of the service. And then at the bottom there, you also see that we have some private lands components as well. In the middle are Partners for Fish and Wildlife program is the private lands arm of the Fish and Wildlife Service. We administer that under the Chief of the Refuge System. Partners for Fish and Wildlife was recently authorized under the Dingle Act, and it is up for reauthorization again. It's on that 5-year cycle. We also oversee the Coastal and Marine Program, where we can do work on both federal and private lands through funding that we receive and are able to leverage. We also oversee the Urban Wildlife Conservation Program for the Fish and Wildlife Service, and I'll get into details about that later. So when we narrow this down to the National Wildlife Refuge System, our units of the system are established for specific purposes, and this makes them really distinct from other public lands out there, in that wildlife conservation really drives everything that we do on National Wildlife Refuges. We're the only federal land management agency that can react to species habitat needs from impacts of climate change, for example. We can establish new refuges, or we can expand existing refuges to meet those needs. So today, there are 2 ways that a National Wildlife Refuge unit can be established. The first is legislatively by an act of Congress, but we can also establish National Wildlife Refuges administratively by the Fish and Wildlife Service Director. So we employ both of those ways of establishing units. When we establish a unit, it is for a specific wildlife purpose. It could be a migratory bird, threatened and endangered species. We have the Big Game Range Act, where we establish big game refuges. And then every use that we allow in a National Wildlife Refuge has to be compatible with that purpose that the refuge was established. So how big are we? Well, we have 850 million acres of lands and waters. This is all dedicated to wildlife conservation. And so I'm going to take you on this, like, come along with me on this imaginary journey. So if you think about the globe, let's go to the east, and you have to go beyond Puerto Rico to the Virgin Islands. We have 3 refuges in the Virgin Islands. And then if you go up past the coast of Maine, all the way to the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge, go down to the Hawaiian Islands, beyond the Hawaiian Islands, beyond Guam, all the way to Mariana Islands, because we've got a marine national monument in the Mariana Islands. Everything within those 2 points of the Virgin Islands to the Mariana Islands, we've got units of the National Wildlife Refuge System, 568 of those. We're in all 50 states and 5 territories. We've got 75 wilderness areas on 64 refuge units, and we've got 38 wetland management districts. So basically, we've got a refuge within 25 miles of a population of 150,000 people. So if we go and take a look at, we have to, it's so expansive that it takes us a couple of slides to show how big it is. These are our marine national monuments in the Pacific. We manage those jointly with NOAA, with NOAA. our other federal partner in managing these. These are only 4 of the marine national monuments because the 5th one is back in the Atlantic, the newest one, the Northeast Canyons and Seamounts. Okay, so where do we do that? Well, I just thought this is kind of a fun little way to depict the size of the National Wildlife Refuge System. If you take a look at the circles, the inner circle shows the numbers of full-time employees, and the outer dotted circle shows what the budget is. And then in the bison, it was a fun way to depict how many acres we're responsible for. So you can take a look at the refuge system. We separated out the marine acres from the land acres with the different colors of blue, but we're certainly trying to manage these with less than 2,500 FTEs and that budget of 541 million. Okay, so this slide is really busy, so let me walk you through it a little bit. On the left side are FTEs, on the bottom are the fiscal year, and on the right are our visitation in millions. And so what you'll see is that fiscal year 10 had been our high mark for our FTEs, or 11 was our hard watermark for FTEs. Fiscal year 10 was our highest budget number at one point in time. Anyhow, what we're trying to show here is that our FTEs have decreased, as you can see, to 22, but our visitation has increased and it's up 36%. In COVID, people found us. And so we're at 67, somewhere around 67 million now in fiscal year 22. We expect that in 23, that'll continue to increase. In the meantime, we did establish 18 new refuges and added almost 600 million acres in the marine environment. All right, so what do we do on National Wildlife Refuges? Well, we manage habitat, we manage water, so we've got to have wage grade professionals to help us with that. We engage in invasive species interventions. We do fire management. Prescribed fire is an incredibly important tool as a habitat management tool for us to help us take care of our lands so we've got healthy lands. Law enforcement is also a major component of keeping our public and our employees safe. One of the things I wanted to mention with our law enforcement is we now have 5 states that have 0 officers. So Connecticut, Delaware, New Hampshire, Ohio, and Vermont have 0 wildlife officers. And we've got 10 states with only 1 officer. So a little concerned about where our staffing is with our law enforcement officers at this point in time. In the interest of time, we're going to keep on going. So Wildlife Refuges really, we're on the front lines of adapting and adjusting to climate changes. And some of the ways that we do that, I'll talk a little bit of this RAD framework that we have and nature-based solutions. So nature-based solutions are actions that we take to protect, to sustainably manage and restore natural and modified ecosystems that address societal changes like climate mitigation, adaptation. One of the things that is really important to us in addressing and implementing nature-based solutions is not only to protect the habitat and our infrastructure, but also that of our neighboring communities. And so when we do have disasters that come through, such as hurricanes, floods, you know, Congress has been very generous in providing disaster supplementals. And so when those disaster supplemental dollars come in, we really take a look at the resiliency of what we put back. We want to put back things that will be resilient when the next storm comes. With regard to managing for climate change, we are employing the framework of resist, accept, direct. That's a framework that we're utilizing. So we may either take the option of resisting climate change, and that means that we're not going to measure it back to that we are maintaining to historical conditions. We might accept that these things are going to happen, you know, without any sort of intervention, or we may start directing it so that we can get to the habitat that we think needs to be there. As I said before, the marine ecosystem is a big part of our portfolio now. We work very closely with NOAA. The International Union for Conservation of Nature recommends that 30% of lands and waters be conserved by 2030, and currently 26% of U.S. waters are protected within the refuge system and managed together with NOAA. President Biden had issued that call to action that we work together to conserve those 30% of lands and waters in America the Beautiful. And so we are pursuing collaborative and inclusive approach to conservation and conserving these. The National Wildlife Refuge System is nimble enough because we can adjust administratively to be able to help contribute and meet this need. I mentioned earlier the Partners for Fish and Wildlife program. This is our voluntary land conservation. 73% of the United States is privately owned. So to achieve this landscape scale type of conservation, we have to engage with our private landowners, and the Fish and Wildlife Service has a voluntary program to be able to do that. People do have to sign on. It's voluntary. They have to sign on for 10 years to keep the wildlife prescriptions in place. We've done some social science, and we have learned that nearly 95% of landowners keep their voluntary conservation project with the Partners program in place, even after their agreement expires. So what that tells us is that we're providing what the landowner needs, and it's benefiting conservation and wildlife as well. Land acquisition is an important piece of what we do in the National Wildlife Refuge System. First, you have to acquire the land in order to protect it before you can start to manage it. So land acquisition really conserves wildlife resources and their habitats. It's also really great in providing corridors, migration paths, connectivity for wildlife, and we do that both through fee title, but also through conservation easements. Conservation easement acquisitions are incredibly important. It helps keep our landowners and their families on the ground, but it also provides great connectivity for habitats. One of the vital aspects of what we do on National Wildlife Refuges is really community-centered conservation. And this is being more inclusive of historically underserved communities. And you can see there that our approach to community is to be community focused, to be intentional, to be inclusive, and to be collaborative. We have 104 urban national wildlife refuges, and these are opportunities we have to bring people in where they are, and then to be able to work directly with them. So the way that we practice that is seen through a host of diverse partners. We have 180 friends groups. These are 501(c) friends groups, nonprofit groups that help us. They work very closely with us in managing our visitor centers, helping to manage our volunteers, just doing all sorts of things that we need to really help manage national wildlife refuges with our youth groups, with our private landowners, all those sorts of things. We have agreements with over 50 national youth partners, and we try to really utilize the Public Land Corps Act in working with those partners to try to help provide opportunities for students coming in. You'll see that volunteer number in the middle there is just over 15,000. That used to be a lot more before COVID. With COVID, it's been a bit of a challenge for us. We lost a lot of volunteers because of COVID, and having to try to bring those back in and having the staff to be able to support volunteers has been a bit of a challenge for us. So let me talk a little bit about the Urban Wildlife Conservation Program. This is a major element of our effort to engage local and historically underserved communities. And it's also new ways that benefit young people with an outcome for wildlife. So on this slide, you'll see that the blue dots are the 101 urban national wildlife refuges. Those orange stars are our flagship sites. And these are places where we have committed and increases that we have received into services. We put $1 million in their base budgets to implement their urban wildlife programs. We do that through our standards of excellence. Things like we need to know and relate to our community. We have to be a community asset. And so we're working towards that. We've actually funded 8 now. We were able to fund the 8th one now in 2023, and just outside of Boise, Idaho, at Deer Flat National Wildlife Refuge. Our goal is to fund 20 urban national wildlife refuges at $1 million. When you give people focused, dedicated dollars, it's amazing the things that they can accomplish. The orange, I guess those are yellow circles are partnership cities. These are places where we have urban wildlife partners where we don't necessarily have a land base. So we work closely with NIFWIP to provide funding for places who will deliver those wildlife conservation messages. As I said, we do more other things for the Fish and Wildlife Service than just the refuge system, and we work closely with our migratory bird folks, and those triangles are the urban bird treaty cities, where our migratory bird program is working closely with those cities to engage folks. At the end of the day, we're wildlife-driven recreational opportunities. We serve 67 million annual recreation visits. Go ahead and move to the next one. There you go. Wildlife driven recreational opportunities. The Refuge System Improvement Act of 1997, it identified 6 priority uses for national wildlife refuges. They're hunting, fishing, wildlife observation and photography, environmental education, interpretation, and you can see who's visiting us and what they're doing when they come to us. These are priorities on every refuge if they're found compatible with the refuge system. So in closing, in terms of wildlife conservation, the refuge system is using sound science to adapt to various biological and environmental challenges. In terms of serving the public, the National Wildlife Refuge System is responding to changing demographics to take wildlife conservation to people where they are and be more welcoming and accommodating to people who visit Fish and Wildlife Service lands and waters. The system is so big, it is a challenge for me to try to fit this into 15 and 20 minutes, but I hope that we've given you at least a little bit of a flavor of who we are, what we do, and if you haven't been to your nearest National Wildlife Refuge, you should let us know and we can try to help make that happen. With that, I'm going to turn the rest of the presentation over to talk about our infrastructure to Rob Miller. Rob is our division chief, our infrastructure management division. He began his career serving this country in the United States Air Force. He spent about 22 years with us here in the Fish and Wildlife Service. He's an engineer by training, and I don't hold that against him. I actually utilize that aspect of it. Rob is one of our most strategic thinkers in Refuge System headquarters. And at this point, I'd love to turn it over to Rob to talk about our infrastructure. Rob, take it away.
Thank you for that introduction, Cynthia, and good morning, everybody. Thank you for joining us for this presentation. From the Fish and Wildlife Service standpoint, I just want to cover a few of the aspects that we have on our overall portfolio. We have 45,000 assets that generate a current replacement value of $54 billion across the portfolio, and that's with the B, billion dollars. Next slide. Over across that portfolio, their deferred maintenance backlog is back up to $1.7 billion at the end of fiscal year 22. Over the last few years, we've seen that portfolio grow by about 20%, 18 to 20% per year. Next slide. One of the first things that I took on when I came to headquarters about 12 years ago was adapting the way that we looked at our infrastructure, the way we did our cost estimates and for current replacement value, as well as the repair needs and the deferred maintenance backlog, which was adapting to an acceptable level of service model. So prior to me coming to headquarters, we would estimate, and many of the other federal agencies do this, we would estimate that 2-track dirt road as if it needed a built-up cross-section, drainage, culverts, and everything else, when in fact that 2-track road is an acceptable level of service for that asset based on the uses that we have for it, whether it be hunting access or administrative access. The people that drive on those roads are 4-wheel drives, and there would be no need for us to improve that road to be the equivalent of an auto tour route or something that you could drive a vehicle on. I'm not aware of any other federal agency or bureau in the interior that's done that. And as you can see, it resulted in us cutting the deferred maintenance backlog in half from 2012 through 2020. Next slide. Our deferred maintenance backlog is projected to grow. As I said, today across the refuge system, it's about 1.7 billion. Within the Fish and Wildlife Service as a whole, it's about $2 billion today. The top line on that, the red line, shows that what would have happened if we would have not had the Great American Outdoor Act and the Legacy Restoration Fund. That 5-year investment has reduced our projected curve of the deferred maintenance backlog by about $1 billion between now and 2050. You can also see the green curve down on the bottom, which shows what is needed or what would happen if we received adequate funding for life cycle investments. Next slide. So life cycle investments are an industry-based standard where they plan to invest anywhere from 2 to 4% of the portfolio's current replacement value to maintain those assets in good condition. Due to the portfolio of the Fish and Wildlife Service, as well as our aggressive use of maintenance action teams and other ways of balancing the work that we do between in-house delivered and externally contracted, we could deliver and reduce or eliminate that deferred maintenance backlog for less than 2%, which is below industry standards. As you can see in these pictures, we've got some examples of what deferring maintenance costs. The pictures that are shown in here along the bottom, as well as on the upper right-hand side, were from the building that's in the background. And the rotting of all of the structural material of the two pictures in the bottom part was showing the replacement of having to reframe that structure and rewire it, re-insulate it, remediate the mold and mildew. Was all a result of the fact that we did not replace the windows and the siding on time. The cost of that project, we estimate, was over double what it would have cost if we would have been able to do that work on time. But because we operate in a deferred maintenance, worst first atmosphere due to the inadequate full life cycle investment funding, which really no one in the federal government or most state and local governments deliver to their infrastructure programs. We all end up doing deferred maintenance, which leads to those increased costs for the American taxpayers. Life cycle investments is shown in the private sector to save anything from 40 to 400% over the cost of waiting for things to be deferred. In addition to those benefits, whether you're investing in construction or rehab and repair, within the Fish and Wildlife Service, we've shown that for every dollar you invest, you get about 1.3 or $3.12 in economic activity, as well as 17.9 jobs for every $1 million invested. And that's all in state and local economies. So with the $42.9 million deferred maintenance appropriation, we estimate that we're going to generate $133 million in state and local economies, as well as generating 768 jobs. Next slide. The Great American Outdoor Act, as I showed earlier, has changed the curve of the trajectory of our deferred maintenance backlog. In addition to that, it has enabled us to make some strategic investments and start transitioning, and through those strategic investments, transitioning into those life cycle investments if we receive adequate funding. We are targeting field station levels where we're trying to reduce or retire the entire deferred maintenance backlog to set those field stations up into a position where they can maintain things in good condition with the funding that they have. Again, the funding is not adequate to prevent deferred maintenance from occurring in the future. As part of our Great American Outdoor Act funding, we also have a line item in there for our maintenance action team projects. When we complete those projects, we see routinely that we can deliver those costs for anywhere from 30 to 70% less than what it costs us to contract it out. In addition to that, through those maintenance action teams, we also complete training to retain the skills of our workforce as we see attrition coming and people retiring that have the skills. We match those folks up with people that are new to the service and wanting to learn those skills. In addition to that, we've seen significant improvements in the professional networks across the service. So when people have problems at their field station that they're not familiar with, they've learned who that they can call and connect with to help solve that problem much easier. We've also seen significant improvement in equipment sharing, as well as mobilization of the workforce to address the problems at field stations when the field stations don't have adequate staff. The overall impact of this has been significant improvement of our overall maintenance professional workforce. Another thing that we use maintenance action teams for is not only training of the maintenance action team folks, but we train other professionals across the Fish and Wildlife Service. That example is with the National Wildlife, or with the Wildland Fire Program. We use the maintenance action teams to provide those wildland firefighters the equipment operating time they need to complete their certificates to qualify for wildland fire experience. Next slide. As Cynthia mentioned earlier, nature-based solutions are a big part of what we're trying to transition to and continue to integrate and expand across the Fish and Wildlife Service. One aspect that Cynthia mentioned earlier is that we do provide support for nature-based solutions and nature-based resiliency projects across the service as a whole. Those projects not only help with all of the aspects that you see on the slide here, but they also help protect the habitats and the neighboring communities, as well as the access to outdoor recreation. One of our focal projects that we're working on with the IRA funds is the Albemarle and Pamlico region. We're working with $27 million of the $125 million received by the National Wildlife Refuge System to invest in that area. We also have a large community partnership with the local communities as well as federal communities set up, and we have routine meetings and are working to leverage that $27 million, and we're hoping to turn it into over $200 million by leveraging all of those additional funding sources. The importance of the AP region is that it's the second largest estuary in the United States, second only to the Chesapeake Bay. And we need to continue to push and support the AP region to get similar protections and support by private sector and nonprofit partnerships, as well as other federal agencies that the Chesapeake Bay receives. In addition to this, during Hurricane Sandy, we did receive recovery, not only recovery funding, but also resiliency funding. That resiliency funding was used to do nature-based resiliency and nature-based solution projects that helps protect the infrastructure so that we don't lose the roads like you see here, and as well as being able to protect those neighboring communities. The Fish and Wildlife Service and other federal bureaus within the Department of Interior have not received resiliency funding as part of the supplemental recovery, disaster recovery funding since Sandy. Next slide. Oh, that may be it for us. So in closing, I want to reinforce or enforce to everybody that the adequately supported infrastructure is vital to every aspect of the National Wildlife Refuge System and the Fish and Wildlife Service. The portfolio supports everything from safe and reliable recreation and access to maintaining water levels that support waterfowl and other species. Engineering with nature not only protects our own lands and infrastructure, but also protects the neighboring communities from disasters and droughts. And with that, I will turn it back over to Caroline. Thank you for your time.
All right, thanks so much, Rob. So for our next speaker, we are going to go ahead and transition over to some of our NGO conservation partners here with us today. So first up, we have Dan Rinn. So Dan Rinn currently serves as the National Director of Government Affairs for Ducks Unlimited. He has served the organization's government affairs team in various capacities since 1994, and he's here to talk about recreation opportunities, history of recreation, and associate management needs within the refuge system. So Jan, go ahead and take it away.
Thanks, Caroline. Thanks, Chief Martinez, for all the work your team does with the refuges. I'll give you a little background about the connection between Ducks Unlimited and the refuge system from the past and then moving into the future. If you're not familiar with Ducks Unlimited, we are a national grassroots organization. We've got a little over 1 million members and supporters. We're in every state and probably every town. We raise money, and that money we then use to reinvest back into wetlands and waterfowl habitat conservation. We probably have 4,000 events every year. And there's definitely one event, at least in your congressional districts. Some places have several. DU was started in the 1930s during the Dust Bowl days by duck hunters. They were concerned when they were seeing fewer and fewer numbers of waterfowl passing through their areas. And that's what sort of gave birth to Ducks Unlimited. If you fast forward now, DU and the refuge system have worked together for decades. If you look at the single most important land management that we have in the United States as it pertains to wetlands, waterfowl, ducks, and duck hunting, it's the National Wildlife Refuge by far. This system of lands, it has hemispheric importance for waterfowl. They are located and managed in strategic ways that really guarantee sort of the long-term conservation of waterfowl and migratory bird habitat. Some refuges have hunting access on them and fishing access on them. Some do not. However, the important part of it is to understand that it's managing this international resource. And so at some point, if you are a duck hunter, irrespective of whether you are actually on that physical refuge, you could be on your own farm, you could be on a different set of lands hunting. I would bet dollars to donuts that the waterfowl you are pursuing at that moment have spent some time on a National Wildlife Refuge system parcel, no doubt in my mind. So it's absolutely critical to waterfowl hunting. What's important to understand now, though, is that this system of lands is diverse enough and big enough that they do not just serve hunters and anglers. There is enough space, there is enough willingness, and there's enough of a need that we are as equally excited about the expansion of the urban refuges. These are wonderful areas that you can bring the services, expertise, and waterfowl management and landscape level conservation to a segment of the population that has never seen it before or hasn't interacted with it before. And its connection to that community, while at the same time supporting the wildlife that will thrive in those areas, is amazing. And if there are a couple high-level points that I want folks to take away from this, is that there shouldn't be any sort of partisanship or competition over usages of these lands. Of course, anecdotally, those issues pop up, but with adequate funding and adequate resources, there is enough land in the wildlife refuge system to address and meet the needs of all Americans. And I mean that. And if you look at, if you go back to your own states and you go back to your own congressional districts, go reach out to the refuge that's closest to your district, and you're going to find them. They're right there. Reach out to those refuge staff, talk to them, let them tell you what they're doing. I guarantee you will be impressed with the level of connection to the community, to your constituents that these professional individuals have. And then you will really understand that these investments, having adequate funding, they're serving your community directly. These are not ambiguous sort of numbers being thrown around. These are operations and maintenance of public lands that serve your constituents at the highest level. And by talking to these refuge managers, you will understand exactly what they're doing and how they're doing it. And I've said this before, I'll say it again. These refuge managers and these refuge staff, you give them duct tape and baling wire and they can fix almost anything. These people are so committed to what they're doing and the resource they're delivering to those communities and to those people, that it will really help you sort of understand how important these lands are to your state, to your community, to your constituents. It's also important to remember that these areas, many of them, are managed for these environmental outcomes, and the management costs money. The same way you have to replace your windows, you have to, paint your house, you have to do those things to maintain a base level. And that's the same thing the refuges are doing. That's the same thing they need to make sure that these systems of lands continue to provide those resources back to their communities. I could go on and on about all of the hunting opportunities that are there, the fishing opportunities that are there. But it's important again to note that if you look at, say, the 2 years around the pandemic, we saw spikes in the sale of fishing licenses, hunting licenses. These people were going out into the wild. In a lot of places, they were refuges. And it wasn't just because people were home and they couldn't go to their offices or they couldn't get into work. Our country needed to connect back to nature in ways that actually provided us a little bit of solitude and a little bit of resiliency. And those aspects of the refuge system and the services that they provide are critical for that. I don't think they get enough credit for that. I don't think people understand that when you're hunting and fishing and you're on these properties, this is your public land, this is your public resource, and there are professionals there that manage it for you. And as we move forward, I hope folks will, again, reach out to your local refuge managers. If you like to hunt and fish, go talk to those folks. They'll help you out. They know that land and that area so well. And again, the value isn't just the actual physical land that they're managing. It's the areas around it. It's that whole complex that interacts between the refuge and whether it's farms and ranches around it. It's really a great resource. If I could leave maybe 1 or 2 points, these dollars that are invested are used very wisely. They have their plans, they're science-based, and they are investments that don't just benefit the wildlife on that area, but the public and the community around it. And I think as we need, and our communities and our country has shown this, we need those connections to the wild outside world. The refuges provide that best opportunity, in my opinion, for the broadest section of the public to actually do that stuff. So I'll answer any questions, but thank you again, Chief Martinez, Caroline, Catherine, especially Mike Thompson, who's been a long supporter of the refuge system.
All right, thanks, Dan. So now we're going to transition over to Christian Hunt. So Christian Hunt works for Defenders of Wildlife. In his role, he works to increase habitat protections and advance imperiled species recovery on the lands and waters of the National Wildlife Refuge System. And he does this by partnering with agency decision makers, members of Congress, works to build coalitions and coordinate with community advocacy efforts. So Christian graduated from law school in 2015, where he studied environmental law with a particular emphasis on climate change in the law and the Endangered Species Act. Christian is admitted to the North Carolina State Bar, holds a JD from Charlotte Law, as well as a BS in geography from the University of North Carolina, Charlotte. So Christian is here today to really dig in on that core wildlife conservation mission of the refuge system and provide us with some more context. So Christian, I will hand it over to you.
All right. Thanks, Caroline, and thanks, folks, for taking the time out of your day to join us. Again, my name is Christian Hunt. You know, we all care very deeply about the refuge system, as you can no doubt tell. And one thing I really like about the refuge system, the fact that really it bears its mission in its name. You know, the National Wildlife Refuge System was created and is managed primarily for wildlife and for the multitude of species that define our American heritage. And in that sense, it's utterly unique. And its importance to wildlife really just be overstated. And in my opinion, this system really marks one of this country's great conservation achievements. And as Cynthia mentioned, it all began with the brown pelican, actually, in a small island in Florida. I was at the beach recently and I saw brown pelicans on crowded boardwalks and even in the busiest of areas. And I tried not to take them for granted because you know, it was not long ago that was a species that was very much on the brink. Plume hunters had just decimated egrets, herons, spoonbills, and even brown pelicans. And it was such a crisis that by the early 1900s, it caught the attention of President Teddy Roosevelt, who very fortunately took action through executive order to create Pelican Island National Wildlife Refuge, which really set the stage for the refuge system as we know it today. It's grown by leaps and bounds. There are now 600 units scattered throughout the country in all 50 states. There's a refuge within an hour's drive of every major metropolitan area. So the refuge system is not really action. You know, you don't need to go watch it on a Netflix documentary. You know, it is nearby and it's accessible. It's also incredibly diverse. There is swamp, coastline, tundra, prairie, tropical forest, ocean, you name it. And the system protects a greater diversity of habitats for wildlife than all other federal land systems. And that's, of course, by design. The refuge system is really at its core meant to mend the wounds we've inflicted on wildlife. And the way we go about doing that, of course, is through the protection of habitats. Habitats that are both high quality and also in an active state of recovery. For instance, you have the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge in the far north, which I'm sure we're all familiar with, but at the size of South Carolina, it protects one of North America's last intact ecosystems. You also have the Desert Refuge in the lower 48, which is the largest and protects habitat for desert tortoises and bighorn sheep. And one you'll hear more about shortly is Okefenokee in Georgia, which protects North America's largest blackwater wetland and arguably the country's last intact freshwater ecosystem. The commonality between all refuges, though, is that they all, to a certain degree, require some sort of active management. And this is particularly the case in the lower 48. The really neat thing about the system, though, and I think one thing that distinguishes it from national forests and BLM lands, is that every single unit is managed for wildlife conservation. And if done in accordance with the Refuge System Improvement Act, should really only get better and better and better with time if properly resourced. And I think there's a lot of great examples of this in the refuge system already. There's St. Mark's in Florida, which I think is a good example. When the service inherited that tract, it was a veritable wasteland. You know, it was denuded of vegetation, but through decades of intensive restoration efforts, it's now become one of Florida's most biodiverse areas, and it supports longleaf pines for endangered red-cockaded woodpeckers, among other species. You also have, famously, the Rocky Mountain Arsenal Refuge in Colorado, which, as you can see, is silhouetted against the Denver skyline. Amazingly, it protects bison and black-footed ferrets on top of a facility that actually used to produce mustard gas during times of warfare. The refuge system is also really unique in the sense that individual refuges are often acquired and managed for target listed species. So over 50 refuges to this point have been acquired under the Acquisition Authority of the Endangered Species Act. And again, many individual units target specific species, one of them being, for example, the Florida panther, which finds sanctuary in its namesake refuge in Florida. That's, of course, a species that once covered the entire Southeast and is now limited to pockets in South Florida. You also have in North Carolina the red wolf, which resides in Alligator River Refuge. This is the only place anywhere in the world where this species is found. And I've actually been out there in the middle of the night on a gravel road, listening to the howls of wolves echo through the pines. And it was just a deeply special experience and something that I hope everybody can get to enjoy someday. There's also Ash Meadows in Nevada, another refuge which supports more endemic species than any other site in the country. And finally, numerous refuges protect the country's smallest turtle, the bog turtle. But what I think is really most telling is the fact that even though the majority of the land base in the refuge system is located in Alaska, the system as a whole still supports 1/3 of all federally listed species. So if we are really serious about protecting America's wildlife and our natural heritage, we have to be fundamentally serious about protecting the refuge system, which unfortunately is starving right now. It is in a time of need. As you've probably gathered thus far, decades of chronic underfunding have resulted in a catastrophic loss of staff within the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, and resulted, frankly, in an inability to manage all of these lands and waters in the way that wildlife truly requires. If we're going to fulfill the vision that was set forward for the refuge system by Congress, it really needs more. It needs more resources. It needs more support. It needs additional champions, which is really why I appreciate so much the opportunity to talk with you all today. And I really hope it marks either the continuance of or the beginning of a relationship in defense and support of the refuge system, which is, again, utterly unique the world over and really deserving of everything we can give it. With that, I'm going to wrap up and kick it back to Caroline. Thank you so much.
Okay, thanks so much, Christian. Really appreciate it. So we've heard a lot of great presentations and discussions so far from both our federal friends as well as some of our conservation partners. Now we're going to take all of this information and just apply it to a specific refuge. So I am really excited that we have Michael Lusk with us here today. So Michael is the refuge manager at the Okefenokee National Wildlife Refuge in South Georgia. And he's going to be talking today about those specific conservation, recreation, stakeholder engagement activities, resource-related challenges that he is facing on his unit. So Michael is a 28-year veteran of the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. He received his BS and MS in Fish and Wildlife Biology with a minor in forestry from NC State University. He is a certified wildlife biologist through the Wildlife Society and a founding member of the organization's Invasive Species Working Group. After a career spent addressing human-wildlife conflict, managing invasive species, and conserving a diversity of at-risk species that's from manatees to native Hawaiian birds, Michael moved to South Georgia in 2013 to become the refuge manager at Okefenokee National Wildlife Refuge. This is the largest national wildlife refuge in the eastern United States. And Michael, I'm really excited for you to dig in today with some details on your refuge unit. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen if you want to get started.
Sure. Great. Thank you, Caroline. I appreciate it. As she said, my name is Michael Lusk, and I'm the manager of the Okefenokee National Wildlife Refuge. And I'm going to ask Caroline, she's going to share some random pictures of the Okefenokee as I speak, so you don't have to just look at me. And as she said, I've been in this position now for almost 10 years, and it is an honor to be invited by the Cooperative Alliance for Refuge Enhancement to speak to you today. As a representative from the field, where thinly spread resources find their real-life implications, I sincerely appreciate the work that CARE has been doing this year to support the National Wildlife Refuge System. I was asked here today to address the Okefenokee National Wildlife Refuge as a case study for resource challenges facing all national wildlife refuges, and I'm honored to do that. Let me begin by saying it has been an honor and a pleasure to spend the majority of my 30-plus year career as a wildlife biologist working for the premier wildlife management agency in the world, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. From the time I finally discovered wildlife biology courses during my third year of college, I knew that I wanted to manage land for the betterment of wildlife and the enjoyment of the American public. During my career with the service, I've actually taken 2 downgrades in positions in order to become a manager of a national wildlife refuge. And I am one of the few people in life who has been able to find the job they always dreamed about by managing one of the flagship refuges in the National Wildlife Refuge System. And I give you all that background just so you know that I am committed to the National Wildlife Refuge System as I describe the challenges we face. So, in order for you to understand some of the challenges we face at the Okefenokee, please indulge me for a moment and let me tell you a little about the Okefenokee National Wildlife Refuge and why it is so special. The Okefenokee National Wildlife Refuge was established in 1937, and at over 407,000 acres, it is the largest national wildlife refuge east of the Mississippi. It protects 93% of the Okefenokee Swamp. And because it lies immediately adjacent to 2 state forests and the Osceola National Forest, the refuge is the anchor to over 700,000 acres of federally and state contiguous protected lands. The refuge was established. Its purpose is to provide breeding ground for migratory birds and other wildlife. The Okefenokee Swamp is the largest and best preserved precipitation-based freshwater wetland ecosystem in the United States. It survived federal programs such as the Swamp Act of 1850 that transferred federally owned wetlands on a vast scale to be drained of their water. The refuge is home to over 850 plant species, 348 vertebrate species, and countless invertebrate species. The protected wildlife includes one of the largest, if not the largest, black bear population in the state of Georgia, the endangered red-cockaded woodpecker that depends on mature longleaf forests, and the extremely rare Swanee snapping turtle, which can grow to over 200 pounds. However, one of the most astonishing things about the Okefenokee National Wildlife Refuge is that the hydrology of the swamp is still intact, meaning that the ecosystem that you see there today is essentially the same as it would have been when humans first beheld its dark flowing waters. Now, the refuge is an internationally recognized designation, seeing approximately 400,000 visitors annually. We are mandated to manage 120 miles of water trails by the Okefenokee Wilderness Act of 1974 that also established 90% of the refuge as a designated wilderness. We maintain 10 backcountry campsites, platforms actually built into the swamp, which allow visitors to experience wilderness camping in the most remote spot in the state of Georgia. But we also help local economies. According to the 2022 Banking on Nature report, the Okefenokee Swamp supports 955 jobs and contributes $24 million annually to local economies. The swamp has been designated as a national natural landmark by the Secretary of Interior and is a wetland of international importance by the Ramsar Convention on Wetlands. The refuge has the approval of the Assistant Secretary Shannon Estenez to seek inscription as a World Heritage Site. If the refuge is inscribed as a World Heritage Site, it would be the first World Heritage Site that is wholly managed by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. And I would like to take a moment to acknowledge that Congressman Buddy Carter introduced a resolution in the House supporting the Okefenokee National Wildlife Refuge as a World Heritage Site. I think some of his staff are attending this brief, and I want to extend the Fish and Wildlife Service's thanks for their ongoing support of the refuge, as well as the support that we've been receiving from Senators Ossoff and Warnock. Lastly, the name Okefenokee itself is derived from an ancient Creek Muskogee word, Ogwafinaga, which means trembling waters in a low place. The swamp is part of the Muskogee Nation ancestral homeland, and the nation has expressed interest in having the refuge designated as a traditional cultural property. The Okefenokee National Wildlife Refuge is indeed a special American treasure, but I realize only one among many in the National Wildlife Refuge system. Now, to speak of our challenges, like other refuges throughout the National Wildlife Refuge system, we manage all these lands and waters and maintain numerous local partnerships in the face of challenges both internal and external, natural and anthropogenic. Chief among them is matching an ever-increasing workload with a finite workforce. Although it is difficult to compare staffing levels between years, most, if not all, refuges have seen significant declines in personnel. For example, in 2008, the Okefenokee Refuge had 28 permanent employees, including fire positions. Currently, in 2023, we have 16 positions. That's a 43% reduction in staffing. And when a vacancy is approved to be filled, an additional challenge arises with the time it takes to fill positions through USA Jobs hiring process and our own JAO. As an example of how staff reductions have impacted us, in 2008, we had 4 full-time visitor services staff to manage our 400,000 visitors. But currently we have none, 0 visitor services staff. We are working to fill our visitor services chief position that has been vacant for the past 9 months, but by the time that person is hired, we will have been without any full-time visitor services staff for over 1 year. What does that mean on the ground? It means we no longer do any programs with local schools. It means we cannot keep up with the numerous requests that we get for information and filming at the refuge. It means we have not hosted the Youth Conservation Corps in the last 3 years because we have no one to supervise them. It means we had to temporarily close our visitor center during our peak visitation visitation season this past spring. And although the visitor service center has now been reopened, it's operating under a greatly reduced hours. Impacts can also be felt elsewhere on the refuge. At its peak, the refuge would have as many as 20 volunteers working full or part-time on the refuge, donating literally thousands of hours of their time. The refuge system depends on volunteers to clean restrooms, mow roadsides, keep water trails trimmed and open, staff the visitor center, give visitor programs, etc. The refuge currently does not have staff to recruit and train new volunteers, so we cannot currently support volunteers at Okefenokee, meaning we have no volunteers, 0 volunteers currently working at the refuge. This loss of capacity has resulted in the loss of thousands of work hours on the refuge. The refuge is also an important partner in local economic development. Refuge staff have diligently been working with partners in the local gateway communities of Charlton, Ware, and Clinch counties, as well as the Okefenokee Swamp Park and the Conservation Fund, to form a unique partnership encouraging sustainable ecotourism to provide an economic boost to this historically poor area. The Okefenokee National Wildlife Refuge is, quite literally, the geographic center of all these economic plans. Unfortunately, if the refuge cannot support current visitation, it will be unable to support increased future visitation and the greater economic vision for all of these surrounding gateway communities. I also mentioned the ecological importance of the refuge. We manage over 38,000 acres of uplands for the restoration of longleaf pine, which was once the most predominant forest type in the southeastern United States. This is the same habitat that hundreds of animal species depend on to be healthy and provide hunting and other opportunities for the public. Unfortunately, the refuge is without any forestry staff on site for the first time in over 50 years. This means we cannot write prescriptions for new and existing forest compartments. We cannot plan and execute thinning to ensure healthy stands into the future, and we cannot properly coordinate with our fire staff to ensure stands are burned properly to assure healthy regeneration and reduce the risk of wildfire. If you cannot manage habitats, you cannot manage the wildlife that depends on those habitats and provide optimal hunting opportunities for the public. The Okefenokee Wilderness Act of 1974 mandated that the refuge maintain 120 miles of water trails for public access. Currently, the refuge only maintains about 105 miles of trail due to staff limitations. Maintaining these trails requires constant attention, as peat and large trees must be cleared and vegetation must be trimmed. Within the next year, we face the prospect of losing our 3-person trail crew due to lack of funding. Like many refuges, we have been using American conservation experience crews to fill gaps in our staffing. If we lose these positions, we estimate that we will need to close approximately 60% of our backcountry trail system and the majority of our overnight camping platforms. And these platforms, I would like to add, were voted the second most beautiful camping areas in the entire United States in a USA Today's reader poll, outshining the Grand Canyon and Yellowstone and other places like that. The staffing issues at the Okefenokee National Wildlife Refuge are, unfortunately, typical for refuges throughout the entire nation. I do not know a single refuge manager that has not experienced substantial loss of staff over the past 10 to 12 years. Most managers I know report a 40 to 60% loss of staff. And like the Okefenokee, they are trying to hold their operations together with duct tape and baling wire. This brings me to a critical question. How are refuges not closing or reducing their services to the public? How are refuges attempting to operate the same as they did 12 years ago? There are 2 parts to that answer. The first part is that there are many refuge operations that have ceased or been curtailed that are not readily visible to the general public, like our forestry operations. The second part lies in the commitment of the staff who work at the National Wildlife Refuges. I can tell you from personal experience that refuge staff are committed above and beyond what should be expected of them. They love the lands they manage and want to fulfill the vision of the National Wildlife Refuge System and the purposes of their individual refuges. And so they fight tooth and claw to keep refuge lands open to the public and well managed to support the wildlife that depends on them. They find ways to save and triage what should probably be let go. The problem with this approach is that the public does not see the struggles, nor are they aware of just how desperate the situation is in the field. The other problem is that the remaining staff are exhausted. They have been asked to do so much with so little for so long. I am incredibly grateful to our dedicated staff for their devotion to the lands they manage, the agency they believe in, the public lands they care about, and the wildlife they love. But the time has come to send in reinforcements. And with that, I appreciate your attention and your good work on behalf of the National Wildlife Refuge System. And I'm now going to turn it back over to Carolyn Murphy. Thank you for your time.
All right, thanks so much, Michael. So we do have a few minutes left for questions today. Just for a brief overview for folks, we have heard a lot of great presentations today. And one of the unifying themes that kind of cut throughout these presentations is the resource limitations and how it impacts all facets of the operations of the National Wildlife Refuge System. It impacts their ability to interact with broader audiences, ensure relevancy and that they are meeting resource-related needs for surrounding communities, and also their ability to deliver effective conservation action. So again, I will relay funding for the refuge system today sits at $541.5 million, $542 million. The need is as high as $1.5 billion annually. And just kind of underpinning where that resource related need comes from. We'll look at staffing. So staffing specifically has faced immense challenges, as relayed by Michael, as relayed by other folks. So since fiscal year 2010, the refuge system has lost 1,100 positions. That is a 25% loss in capacity for refuge system employees. And that, again, as relayed, has significant ripple effects, not only in the ability to manage, to be relevant to the public, to conserve, but also things like volunteer services, the inability to, even just put volunteers on the ground because there is no one there within the service to manage these folks in a field setting. So with that, I am going to go ahead and transition us to some questions. So the first question we saw from folks, let's see, first question. Okay, so you received one question specific to Good Neighbor Authority as requested in the fiscal year 2024 budget request to Congress. So several natural resource agencies at the federal level do have Good Neighbor Authority, which allows them to work directly work with other stakeholders to get conservation and management actions on the ground. So Chief Martinez, we'll start with you. Can you speak to what this Good Neighbor Authority request is for the fiscal year 2024 budget?
Sure. Thank you for the question. And you can also go to the Green Book to see generally, but basically what Good Neighbor Authority authorizes states and counties and tribes to enter into what's called a Good Neighbor Agreement. And what that allows is it allows those entities to perform forest, rangeland, watershed restoration work on those federal land management agencies. Some of those activities would be things like including treating insect and disease infested trees, or reducing hazardous fuels. As I mentioned, we use a lot of prescribed fire on our lands, and then any other activities to restore or improve forest, rangeland, or watershed health, including fish and wildlife habitat. Currently, that authority is with the Forest Service and with the Bureau of Land Management, but neither the Fish and Wildlife Service nor the Park Service have that authority, and it's worked really well for the other bureaus. So something that would be useful certainly in helping us work with our neighbors. The other one that goes along with that, while I have the mic, is the Stewardship Contracting Authority. And that would allow the Fish and Wildlife Service to trade forest products for land management and services. So for example, in exchange for thinning the forest and keeping the trees to sell, a contractor or an organization performs service work that helps to achieve some of our key land management goals, such as improving wildlife habitat or reestablishing native plant species. So this authority would extend, these authorities to include the Fish and Wildlife Service, something that other federal land management agencies already have. Thanks for the question.
All right, great. Thanks so much. So I realize we are almost at the top of the hour, so thank you all for staying on for the duration of this briefing. I'm going to flag one more question for everyone before we wrap. We did receive a question on a request to elaborate on the importance of public lands for communities and climate change and how those interact. So I know we had a couple notes in the Q&A, but if anyone wants to elaborate on the importance of these lands and waters for communities and adapting to a changing climate, I will throw it out there.
Well, in the interest of time, I'll just go ahead and jump in, right? Like federally administered public lands, especially, Fish and Wildlife Service, we're often in the coastal and riverine systems that are valuable or that are vulnerable to disasters, quite honestly. And so protection of these lands, we can help protect neighboring communities by retaining water, constructing beach dunes, and restoring wetlands and marshes against storm surges and hurricanes. However, these investments through appropriations and disaster recovery and other sources really need to be increased and expanded in order to support the authority for the private and state land restoration and nature-based solutions so that we can protect both federal and neighboring lands and communities. And I think that Eric might have added another into the chat as well that provided some more information.
Okay, great. Thanks so much, Chief Martinez. So to close us out today, I'm going to share my screen one more time. All right, so for any folks that did not get their questions answered today, I have included my email in there. I've also included my colleague, Libby Marking, who again was unable to join us today, but is the chair of the Cooperative Alliance for Refuge Enhancement. So any refuge system resource related need questions you have, please feel free to send our way. I also did want to do one more plug for the Congressional Wildlife Refuge Caucus. If your boss is interested in joining this caucus, we would love to have you, but please go ahead and reach out to Catherine Altome, again with Congressman Mike Thompson's office, and she would be happy to move you through that process. So with that, I will let everyone go. Really appreciate you all joining us today, and we hope you all have a great holiday weekend. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.